Okay. We'll start in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'll do in this speech is explain what this crackdown looks like and how we transition away from that crackdown and walk it back. Secondly, I'll explain why reversing this decision will enable China to become more prosperous than it would if it had not reversed this decision. And I'll explain finally why China's children will be better educated with this reversal than they would be in the alternative. First question, what does it look like and how will we do a seamless transition? Obviously, we think this crackdown obviously looks like a crackdown. We think it really has impeded the ability of this industry to get anywhere or grow. And that's for 4 reasons. 1, obviously you're just banning companies from making money in the first instance, which means very few of them have an incentive to continue operating. 2, we point out that often it means it's really hard to create new companies. It's obviously hard to get new competition, and just broadly industry can't grow really from where it is right now. 3, you lock out the ability of FDI because you restrict the ability of variable interest entities to bring foreign capital in. And for reasons I'll explain later, foreign capital is quite important in expanding the size of these companies. And 4, obviously the people in this industry are quite sensitive to the signals that CCP sends about the nature of the industry and whether or not it's something that is or isn't approved. And therefore it's very unlikely this industry would persist in any particular big way were it not for this crackdown. So, given that the stakes of this debate are, this crackdown means that the private education industry will increase no longer exist in this debate. How do we walk away from that? The thing we point out is that China framing things as a temporary crackdown, and it's quite easy to do, really. They did this with Didi, they did this with Ant, they did this with a variety of other companies. They just kind of say, oh, this is a temporary crackdown. They also do this with a lot of foreign investment. They kind of freeze foreign temporarily. In a way, it's often just like, it's kind of if they to remind you that they're there and that kind of thing. But it's a very, very common practice for the CCP to do and for the Chinese government to do. So we think they can just do this and it'll be relatively costless. We also think, of course, the CCP has a pretty strong control within Chinese society. So they're likely to be able to frame
Brendan,
this
could you just stop for a second there?
Quite easy to Sure.
Brendan,
Yep.
You're just cutting out a bit as you're speaking. It might be better to continue with your camera off there. I paused you at 2 minutes and 2 seconds, and you were just talking about why China used this to remind you they're there, and also that was a common practice that is costless.
Cool. So essentially, what they would do is instead of framing this as a walk back, they would just say the crackdown on the private education industry was a temporary crackdown, but it's now clear to go ahead. They have done this many times before with Didi, with Ant Financial, with a variety of other companies. A lot of foreign investment gets temporarily frozen and then unfrozen. It is relatively common practice, and therefore it's unlikely to be something the CCP will have to spend very much time or energy devoting themselves to. We also think they have strong control of state media and state internet, and they have a lot of social power, which means that they're unlikely to be very criticized and be easy for them to walk this back. And finally, we think it's likely to be very, very popular because most Chinese parents really are interested and want this service, and therefore it's unlikely to be scrutinized very much. All of that means that China doing this costs very, very little political capital. They honestly have to spend no money, and they probably have to spend a little bit less money because the alternative is them spending money on trying to enforce this ban. And what that means really is that the other side can't claim or doesn't have very much political capital or actual capital to work with in forming a counterprop if that was something they chose to do. So with that out of the way, we understand what the crackdown looks like. We understand its implication in the industry. We understand how China would easily walk it back. Let's now explain how this is a free win and allows China to become far more prosperous than it would otherwise. 2 useful observations in characterization at the start of this argument. The first thing I'd point out is the history here for China is that in its stage in economic development is that it can't really go very much further as a manufacturing power, right? It's built its growth on a very high savings, high capital expenditure model. But obviously, as you spend more and more capital and build more and more infrastructure, there reaches a point where your population cannot absorb heaps and heaps of more hard infrastructure, or things like factories, things like roads, etc. And also, you kind of need to begin to transition away to becoming a service economy. Obviously, you want to be higher in the value chain and producing higher, more expensive goods and services so you can charge higher prices and earn a higher income. And also, of course, as you develop your manufacturing base and you try and go along, manufacturing becomes increasingly expensive for you. All of which means that you need a thriving service industry. It's one of the things that China needs to transition to. It's a consumer economy with a thriving service industry. The second thing we point out in characterization is that China has a very, very good history of in education and private education, and in particular in private education and edutech. And that's because they were just one of the first countries to really move into this space. They've been here for quite a while. There's in part explained by the very high demand for private education within China and among Chinese parents, and therefore it's quite likely that they'd be very good in the future and maintaining that edge, and they have a comparative advantage here. So what are the implications of that? The implications of that is if you get the foot off the throat of this industry, it's likely to be a really strong engine for growth and the kind of growth China needs, in the sense that it's a service economy that's serving a particularly large and thriving consumer base. We're also talking here about edutech and companies that are on the kind of leading edge of edutech technology, which is really important for China as it's trying to transition into becoming a more technologically advanced economy as well. And importantly, it's obviously a very important driver of growth. And growth is broadly good because it means that people can gain more income. It means that people get services that they like, and that income can be recycled for the economy, and that economy can grow. People can have more things, and quality of life can improve. The reason why that can't happen under their side is obviously, one, there is a profit motivator that is required for entities that provide private tutoring to want to expand and to innovate, and you need that profit incentive to do that. Obviously, also, if you're profit motivated, you just go somewhere else. People are unlikely to enter a dying industry, etc. Secondly, people are obviously very sensitive to what the CCP wants, which means they're unlikely to want to be interested in expanding or growing an industry that seems to be something that is important. And finally, we think that this industry needs a lot of cheap capital because a lot of it is tech related. It involves high upfront costs in terms of investment, high labor costs as well. In those early stages, you probably need to spend a fair bit of money. And post Evergrande, a lot of Chinese investors are very nervous and very bearish broadly, don't want to spend their money too much, whereas Western investors are really, really keen for return given low interest rates. And that means you're just very likely to have quite a lot of willing foreign capital, which will help you expand this growing and thriving industry. That explains why it's better for China's economy. Finally, why does this lead to China's children being poorly, why does walking it back lead to China's children being better educated than the alternative that side negative has to defend? Well, the first thing we'd explain, and kind of his characterization about the Chinese education system, it's really competitive at the top end, right? And that's because relative to the size of the student population, there are remarkably few top prestigious university spots, and also the Gaokao is incredibly competitive. And finally, there are also a set of really strong cultural preferences and revealed preferences among Chinese parents in order for their kids to really focus and value education. The second thing we point out here, though, is that China's education system is really unequal, right? And that's because rural China is really, 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 really poor, right? Now nearly maybe 200 million people in China live on less than $5 a day, and those people do not live in good school districts. They live in very poor parts of the country. The good schools are concentrated in places like Shanghai and Beijing, which is obviously where all the party elites live. And that's also why when you see China doing super well on the PISA scores and the academic scoring, that's because they only allow the schools from the cities of Shanghai to be used. They don't allow scores from rural China, which are worse than many, many other countries in the world. Overall, China is actually quite bad at educating the vast majority of the people who live there. Why would tutoring fix this? People pay for tutoring because it works. We know that from empirical literature. It's one of the most well-validated things that works well. We also know that because there's a lot of competition. People, want to do well, and people will be able to compare and get the best option for them. We think, especially in a context where your school is very, very poor, you need that education. And also, it's becoming, and also just broadly being more educated is obviously a very, very good thing. We think in the status quo, people are limited by their geographic location, by their income, by their position in the party hierarchy. They are locked out of being able to access good schools, and those schools are criminally underinvested in, and they are the set of people who would not be able to access these things, right? Because companies want to spread to new markets. They want to access new people. They want to provide very low cost online tutoring, for example. They want to, especially education tutoring, which is often the marginal cost of sending out a video that explains a particular maths concept is very, very small and easy to do online. And importantly, it's the rich people who will still be able to hire foreign tutors or get ACL because they have educated family members, have those family members help their
Brendan,
kids.
just letting you know you're over time
survive,
there.
Not the poor. Thank you.
Awesome. I thank them for their speech. I now welcome the first speaker of the negative team to open their team's case. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great, thank you so much. I'll also turn on my camera whilst I'm doing that. I guess some trigger warnings, because perhaps I'm going to be using a bit of explicit language regarding mental health. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We on side negative oppose private tutors due to two things. One is in this huge contributing factor to economic inequality, and we rather think that this exacerbates these things. The second is the creation of toxic competitive environments, especially for children, especially for teenagers, which puts massive pressure and it results in mental illnesses for these people. The thing that I also want to get clear is the fact that we also agree with the problems that are put forward by Affirmative, the fact that there are economic gaps. The fact that in the question of this debate is, in the sense we have private tutors, does this actually expand the gap? We think it expands the gap, and the burden on that affirmative bench was to prove why this diminished. I'm going to significantly explain to you throughout my substantives why this increases the educational gap and therefore the economic inequality that exists, right? And the really intuitive thing to note here is because of the fact that demand on a private tutor is produced on relative success that a person has. That is that you want your child to succeed and go to a really prestigious university. That means sidelining getting specific resources for that individual is not concerned with upholding everyone's education. And there's the precise reason why, as a private investor, if you're able to make the most money off of the most privileged people, why you then create economic disparities in private tutoring is an exacerbating factor on that front. Two arguments to forward from first negative. Firstly, why does private tutoring lead to substantial problems under the status quo? Secondarily, why the counterfactual and the abolishment of this, I think the gradual abolishment of this, as is implied in the most info slide, is going to rectify these issues. So I first want to establish why private tutors are likely to be inaccessible to the vast majority of people. And this directly contends with the things that we get from first Affirmative. We think that there are three structural reasons for this. Firstly, is the fact that if you have a good private tutor, the fact that it demands a significant amount of money for you to hire good teachers and get significant amount of education. The fact that you have to hire people with good diplomas, and obviously they went from good universities, and therefore these people who come from good universities want to demand higher salaries and higher pay, means that these were likely to create significant educational systems for that. The second is the fact that it demands a lot of money for you to create infrastructure in these places, which meant that, for example, in order for you to get that good quality education, you have to also get good infrastructure. The fact that you also have to put in an accessible place, for example, within your town, the fact you have to buy iPads, for example, the fact that you have to create systems within teachers and the internet facilities for you to create these programs that are then able to deliver good educational programs to people. Therefore, this is likely to be something that was incredibly big, right? The third is the most obvious reason is the fact that you can also capitalize on fear mongering. The fact that you can also go on and capitalize on the fears of the parents who want to put their children into good schools, and the fact that you can say, oh, you if you don't study as much, or if you don't put you in our school, you're going to definitely fail, and therefore they can capitalize it, and they're able to then make money off of saying, for example, you have to pay this amount of money so that you can take these courses, and by taking these courses, you can go to these universities. So what I've illustrated to you here is the fact that good private schools, and that are likely to exist and that have existed empirically in China, are likely to be those that demand huge sums of money and therefore are only accessible to the most top ends of society, and therefore this exacerbates the issues that are taken by first F. The second is why private tutors are uniquely effective in creation of going to good universities, right? And this is for a couple of reasons. The first is that obviously the fact that they teach you about the secret tips and tendencies of that. They have researchers, they have people who research into the very trends and what is going on in that university, and therefore you can prepare for the entrance examinations that occur, right? The second is the fact that they offer really high quality classes because of the characterization that I just explained to you before. The fact that obviously they have good teachers, for the fact that they hire teachers from good universities, means that they're able to then have good classes on that front. Also the fact that they are probably likely to be very accessible to your school, like they might be in a station or two nearby your school, and therefore they're able to establish a network in which you're able to just commute really quickly to that class, and therefore you're able to cut the amount of time that you lose by transport, and therefore you're able to study significantly more, right? And the third is because of the fact that there's likely to be lots of connections. So you're likely to have lots of connections with alumni from universities. If you graduate from a specific public school, you're able to have networks with specific universities, for example, and therefore this means that you're able to have increased infrastructure, increased chances for you as a person to be able to go to a good university if you attend these private schools. So why is it the case, and this is extremely harmful in terms of perpetuating economic gaps? Because we think that the economic gap in China, or educational gap, is obviously due and is something that is made worse by the existence of these private tutors. We think that there are three mechanisms for this. Firstly, is the fact that these private schools are also zero-sum. And I think this is something that First Affirmative also agrees on. The fact that you have limited amount of slots to compete means that if you pass, then someone else fails. And therefore, there's just a limited amount of slots, which mean that obviously competition exists. And therefore, the people who have access to the best resources to go to education are likely to be those that pass. The second is the fact that you don't have quotas, right? Unlike Western educational systems where you have essays and other holistic and perhaps subjective methods of getting in, there's absolutely no such thing in Gaokao. There's absolutely no thing in the university exams in China. It's all based on numerical things, which is all contingent on the amount of studying that you do. And therefore, this is something that's likely to be something that is really benefited by private tutoring. The third is the fact that obviously, this creates a substantially competitive advantage in getting a good job, because a degree from Peking University is able to bypass almost every other factor. The fact that this automatically lands you in a slot at consulting a firm, for example, and therefore it's likely to be uniquely good. And this continues intergenerationally because those people grew up to be very rich, they send their children to private schools, and therefore they're able to then have that cycle continuing on where they're able to have perpetual economic gaps, right? So the conclusion of this is, I think, quite clear. It's twofold. One, the fact that the accumulation of capital and consolidation of that capital, the fact that then wealth is consolidated within certain areas and that is perpetuated intergenerationally through the mechanism that I told you. The poor are always poor because they have structurally barred from accessing the top level university, like the cram schools, and therefore they can't access the good universities, and therefore they are discriminated based on their diplomas. Whereas on our side of the house, on the counterfactual, the wealthy people are able to go on these areas. But the second thing that I also point to is the fact that these tutors and organizations overly pressure students into longer studying for longer and longer hours due to the competitive nature that exists. And we have to note that this is a significant problem, particularly within Northeastern countries. From where I come from, this is really graphic, but the day after the exam is over, when you know that you have failed, the trains actually delay because of the fact that students actually commit suicide on the trains. And this is something that is an incredibly big problem within these places that we honestly think we should rectify. We should never have teenagers and children suffering such a degree of pressure to which they're willing to take their own lives. And this is something that is perpetuated by the fact of these systems existing. So why on the counterfactual, then on my second point, are we then able to rectify these issues? Because we think that the educational system in our world is one in which private tutors do not exist, and therefore we're likely to rectify these issues through three mechanisms. One is the fact that the quality of services is likely to be substantially lower due to the fact that you do not have access to the foreign investment. And I think this is largely conceded by First App. The fact that you don't have super high level teachers that you can put in tutors means that the overall level of education perhaps might decrease, but the fact that then the pressure doesn't also exist as well. The second is it's significantly more accessible to a lot more people because you don't have the incentive to limit it to a specific base because you don't have the relative advantage because you can't make profit off of it. It means that you're likely to widen the scope and you're able to have more people and appeal to a wider range of students, and therefore you're able to do something that's likely to be beneficial. But the third reason is because of the fact that obviously these organizations disappear over time. The fact that China has banned the creation of new companies, and the fact that these the companies that exist now suffer from significant deep benefits or disadvantages means that they're likely to dwindle and are not likely to be sustainable in the long term. So in the long term, they're likely to disappear. So for all of those reasons, this means that the private institution that has caused these economic gaps are likely to be exacerbated, and therefore you get rid of all the problems that I've mentioned to you. That is the conclusion, obviously, and the fact that we're able to then massively reduce the educational gap because then the rich can't put people into private tutors with private tutor educational facilities where then they're able to have those people go to Peking University, for example, and therefore it significantly puts a competitive edge, so that the rich people do not have a competitive edge within the education, and therefore poor and middle class people are put on a more even level playing field. The fact that they can have and go to good universities for factors that are actually within their control and can pass exams as a result of that. The last is obviously the fact that you're able to get rid of the toxic competition because obviously these corporations don't have incentive to make those things. For all those reasons, very proud to negate.
Great, I thank them for their speech. I now welcome the second speaker of the affirming team. Here.
Just checking I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Alrighty. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 dying facts about that negative team case. 1, they give absolutely no response to why we get net more economic growth, which leads to net more utility for people all across China. But secondly, they don't give you a single reason, and you can check your notes and you can check them again, for why the rich won't still get ahead in their world. Firstly, let's look about how this transition actually looks, because they agreed with basically everything that we told you. They told you, firstly, the quality of the service will be significantly lower. Secondly, there'll be no incentive to price gouge because you won't be able to get any money from anybody. And thirdly, that they're going to disappear over time. I think that the third mechanism does a lot of my rebuttal work for me, which is that they seem to suggest that there will be some sort of coaching center existing in the future, a non-profit that is going to accept students from rural backgrounds, that is somehow magically going to be accessible to them, even though they don't have any money to outreach those students, and that will somehow decrease the gap of education between the poor and the rich. No, that's not what's going to happen in this debate. Coaching colleges will cease to exist, and wealthy people seeking educational advantages will continue for all the reasons they told you about how much cultural pressure there is towards that, for all the reasons they told you about how hard the Gaokao is, for all the reasons they told you about how important it was to go to a good university. So wealthy people will just seek that out in far more pernicious and unaccessible to poorer people ways. So there will be no more coaching colleges, but what will there be instead? There will be the same number of people who know that they can price gouge parents for the child's future, for fear of the child's future, know that they can make money from it, will do it privately out of the eyes of the government, will do it cash in hand, will still pay for, be paid for a session sharing tips with that student, but they won't be doing it to a class of 30 children that can join them online over Zoom, that can sign up for a week, that can try the course for free, that can go to a competing lower quality college. No, it will just be to the extremely wealthy students and nobody else. So either there'll be no coaching colleges and no tutoring at all, in which case, even if that tutoring doesn't exist, even if people completely abandoned on educating anybody for money, then you still have to deal with the fact that the schooling system is incredibly unequal within China, that those people who still go to rural schools will be just as bad off in this side of this debate. So at the end of this point, negative mustn't rely on the expenditure of political capital in order to improve the the equality of education in the status quo, because we told you reasons why this doesn't take much political capital to allow coaching colleges to keep on going, to take off the stifling model that the CCP has put onto them. Therefore, they must prove that the private educational system, when it is unbridled by the CCP, generates more harm and less benefits than it does when it is crippled by the CCP, and they have failed to do that. So firstly, on educational equality, they told you a couple of things. They told you that, look, this is really unequal because it's highly likely that it's going to be, firstly, good tutors will charge more because they have better diplomas, so it is only able to be accessed by people who are rich. Secondly, that the infrastructure is kind of inaccessible, that people need to buy iPads and be able to access an expensive building in order to go to these programs. And thirdly, that due to fear-mongering, there will be a great deal of price gouging and price competitiveness going on, so parents are going to price each other out, meaning that at the end of the day, not everybody gets to go to these coaching colleges. A couple of responses. In fact, the profit-seeking model of educational coaching colleges fixes a lot of these problems. And while it might not perfectly fix them, it fixes them a lot better than the local education system ever can. So firstly, why do private education profit seekers drive down the cost of educational resources? Well, the first reason that they do is because educational resources, once they are made by a private company with the access of foreign investment, the cost of each individual student then accessing that resource, for example, a video that has been filmed that can then be sold on to new users, the amount you need to charge for that is actually pretty low in order to be making a profit, because it's a fixed cost, but it's not a continual cost. So those educational resources are actually pretty cheap once they are made, and the more of them that are made, the more there are competing on the market, so the cheaper they get, that drives the prices down. Secondly, though, they have an incentive to cater to a wide client base, meaning that while some tutors might have a profitable incentive to price gouge and charge the highest prices, from the free market that actually markets naturally reach a point of efficiency, where they're clear, where everybody's willingness to pay is met by some sort of provider in the market. So there'll be a provider for the high willingness to pay customers, and then there'll be a cheaper cost provider for the people who can't afford to pay as much. So because they are able to get some profit from that, but they're not necessarily as high of a margin as the people paying hundreds of thousands of dollars per session, it means it's still a profitable business for them to run, but only in the world where the CCP doesn't force them to register as an NGO. Thirdly, though, we told you that as China is a leading competitive leader in the educational tech industry, it's highly likely that these lessons are online. We saw this happen throughout 2020 and 2021, where now a lot of these classes are run on Zoom, Therefore, geographically, they are easier to access than school ever will be. And fourthly, that profit-seeking causes people to find new ways to reduce their fixed costs, which means that ultimately they innovate new ways to reduce the cost of education, further bringing down that cost. But fifthly, this is the best way to learn and practice English when you allowed foreign direct investment, which is really important because people at rural schools were less likely to get access to tutors or to exposure to people in the city who were good at English. And it meant that they had that opportunity to get that skill that was often very necessary for being successful later on in the working world. But why will public schools never be as good at this? Because when I prove that public schools will never be able to be equal, that means that the negative team is dead in the water in this debate. The first reason that they'll never be as equal is because service provision in China is determined by the local government and funded by the local government rather than the federal government. Now, that's due to things like the Hukou system, where local governments don't have many mechanisms for raising money. For example, they used to be able to do it by selling land, but ever since the Evergrande crisis happened, they know that has been severely cracked down on. So there are very few revenue raising opportunities for these local governments, which means that it is, and they don't have money to invest into schools, into new technologies that are going to make education better, right? But secondly, it's incredibly difficult to pursue this any shift from this system where local schools or poor local governments are just crap, because it would involve taxing the elites of those local governments, the CCP elites, way more than they currently are, and would take way too much political capital for the negative team to support that in this debate, which means that public schools will never be as good. So when they tell you all of these harms about getting tips for good unis, that classes of high quality and connections are essential into getting into university, on their side of the house, rich people still found ways to do that. They were more likely to have people in their family who went to university that they could talk to about this. On our side of the house, we got more low-cost players entering the market. We got a tutor having a class of 30 in front of them instead of a class of 2 siblings from the richest merchants in town. And it meant that they shared those tips with more people and that educational access got better overall. A quick response to wellbeing, which is the most underdeveloped point I've ever seen in a debate. They basically said, look, this is going to be really hard for people because they get pushed to work longer and longer hours. This is caused by the Gaokao exam and not by private education in and of itself. We would argue that similar pressure will exist no matter what. But in fact, we're going to see you have less agency in their world, because even if you have money and you know you're going to fail your maths exam, in our world, you can pay for a 1-hour tutoring session at a coaching college that gives you a fighting chance of passing. In their world, you cannot. You are stuck at your shitty school and you have no chance. You are more likely to feel that negative impact on your well-being. Finally, whipping the material on the economy, which has not been responded to in this debate. We prove to you that we are going to get more economic growth because China has exhausted its manufacturing-based growth, that its capital dependency ratio is extremely high, that it needs to transition to a service-based economy, and that this is the best way to improve the quality of human capital, which is one of the biggest economic inputs for long-term economic growth. That means that if the entire economy gets more successful, then the entire utility of everybody in China gets better. And all of the analysis they gave you about economic inequality stemming from education was going to be true no matter what in this debate. But if we lifted up the entire economy on the whole, we were able to afford more things. We were able to produce better skilled workers, which was better for everybody at the end of this debate. Being educated was so important. It allowed you to make better decisions. It allowed you to be better informed. It meant that your life had more meaning, and we were so proud to propose.
Great. I thank them for their speech. I now welcome the second speaker of the negative team. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This team's best impact is prosperity of the Chinese economy. I actually don't really care about this impact, because insofar as this does not trickle down to those that need prosperity most and gets concentrated amongst the elite, like I really don't understand what the impact of this is. I would rather a world where there is marginally smaller economic growth, but that is accessible to people who need it the most. A lot of responses to this affirmative team. The first thing that they say is that the rich will still come ahead anyway because they have access to things like private tutors. They actually don't really show themselves why this is possible in the first instance. And I think the fact that they assume that people would secretly do this kind of really underestimates the extent to which CCP has control over the Chinese society as a whole. I would suggest that the people who can teach these people, for example, people who are relatively privileged, are most likely to not want to risk the risk of being jailed into prison, for example. Like, it's just a massive risk that is not worth the amount of money that they can get in return. I don't think this will happen. I doubt it will happen in reality. The second thing that they say, and their biggest case in this debate, is that, well, thriving service industry is necessary, and education was good in the past, it will be good in the future as well. 3 points of responses. Firstly, aside from the fact that they just assert that Chinese economy is struggling and somehow that service industry would be a magical savior, for example, that solves every problem that the Chinese economy is facing, I would suggest at best what the government side says in this debate is education good in the past, not private education good in the past. It's unclear why private education was any necessary or any essential in the process of Chinese prosperity in the first place. But second of all, the things that students learn through these private industry is things like general knowledge and general skill, as opposed to practical knowledge such as programming, and they tend to be a very niche part of that general knowledge. The reason for this is because obviously we're targeting high school students. These people have a variety and diverse needs, for example, diverse types of dreams, for example. You cannot necessarily force them to learn practical skills that gets applied in corporations, for example, because that is just not generally applicable to majority of individuals that take the test in the first instance. You do not learn programming at private schools. You learn this oftentimes at universities, for example. You learn this through corporate training, for example. And I would add to this that you do not learn how to speak English within this process as well, because obviously what you learn is things like grammar of English as opposed to the actual ability to speak, to the extent no one can assess millions and millions of people taking Gaokao tests every day on the basis of their speaking ability. This was useless. Third of all, I would suggest that we actually increase the ability of individuals to be economically productive on the other side of the house. There are two reasons as to why this is likely. Number one, obviously, parents want their children to do well on either side of the house, but uniquely on the other side of the house, the option to get them into good university does not exist in the first instance, or you at the very least cannot use your money to facilitate that process. In that specific instance, I would suggest that parents have a greater incentive for them to increase the employability of your children in the future to be able to function as a safety net, for example. In that specific instance, this is the moment at which parents have an incentive, for example, to start teaching practical skills, for example, that does not necessarily affect the university entrance, but may well have an impact in the future, as suggested by this affirmative team. So in fact, we are the team that increases and maximizes this educational ability that is necessary for economic production. But secondarily, I would suggest, to the extent that private industry is the reason why things are so competitive in the status quo, this is the reason as to why individuals, once they pass the Gaokao, for example, gets burned out, for example, because they feel like they've achieved the biggest thing in their life and the biggest determinant of success in their life. This means that individuals, oftentimes in Asian societies, do not have the motivation to continue on learning once they've achieved that one particular goal of life in the first place. We think it is more likely on the other side of the house that the students continue on pursuing things to the extent university entrance will not be a marker of success anymore on the other side of the house. We completely flip their case, even if it stood in the first place, given all of the assertions. And notice that this engages with their claim about investment too, because if it is the case that they don't get greater amount of people who are educated, then obviously that point doesn't stand. But I would suggest additionally that it's unclear why they get any of investment in the first place, because obviously the West hates uncertainty, because that is what investors don't like the most, because that is a substantial risk. In fact, they increase that uncertainty because you're basically backtracking your decision that you have already made in the past. That's just additional uncertainty and additional risk for investors to stay away from the Chinese economy. The final thing I want to engage with is their claim that tutoring is effective in reducing things like educational gaps. Number one, I think they do nothing to show why it is actually effective or accessible. Like things like location and income, by and large, are determinants of whether or not you can have access to good private tutor schools in the first place. And cheap ones are oftentimes, as suggested by Ryosuke, not useful for the reason that obviously, you don't have the, obviously these are costly resources that you need in order to be an effective teacher, provide effective materials, for example. It's unclear why this was useful in the first instance. But secondly, I actually doubt why companies have an incentive to expand into rural areas as well. They said, it's fixed cost and you don't need additional cost. Number one, like it's still expensive to advertise, for example. And also additionally, you lose your customers in cities, for example, for middle class, those that are rich, for example, because they know that you're freely providing your material to the rural area, for example. Like they'll be pissed. They're more likely to move away from your particular corporation, or they're likely to ask you to drastically reduce prices. So your incentive is to make it exclusive as possible to people who are willing and able to pay as high price as possible. But lastly, if it is the case that you do not need additional cost, that sounds like a reason to support our paradigm, because that just means that NGOs are very capable of doing the same thing. I don't understand why this was unique to their side of the house. That is the affirmative team dying in this debate. First question, why is private school the cause of competition? Because this is something that the affirmative challenges. 3 reasons. Firstly, they create severe competition in the first instance through things like fear-mongering advertisements, because that is the means of their marketing. That is the way in which they survive in the industry in the first place. Secondly, they pressure universities through things like lobbying to increase the hurdles of their examination, because that is obviously the reason as to why they can survive in the economy and in the industry as well. Additionally, rich parents oftentimes connected to universities also have the same incentive, because obviously the children that are comparatively better at doing, solving more difficult math problems, for example, they want these kids to do well, and the way in which they do well is to make the university exams more difficult in the first place. But lastly, obviously this indirectly incentivizes universities to become more inaccessible as well, because oftentimes what happens if you keep the low standard is that you won't be able to select anymore, because people by and large have access to the private industry, and you won't be able to meaningfully distinguish between the students. So the incentive again is to make examination as difficult as possible under their side of the house. What then is the comparative? Obviously the Gaokao will remain, but our argument is that it will be conducted in a more equitable manner, and this is for 2 reasons. The first is that it will become substantially more accessible to individuals, in the sense that it will not require things like formulae that you do not learn at school and you learn exclusively at private schools. The reason for this is obviously that no one would be able to teach these complicated things in the first place. Like obviously your parents would have forgotten about all of the things that you've learned at high school. There is no one within your family, for example, that is willing and able to teach these things for free, or at the very least, the critical mass won't be able to access this, which means there's an existing ability on the outside of the house for the underprivileged to do well as well, because what you need is the practice and the knowledge about basic concept that you learn at school. These are more accessible and significantly more accessible on a scale on the outside of the house. But secondly, it allows for redistribution. What do I mean? Firstly, it expands public education for the reason that Xi Jinping obviously has an incentive to expand to communities in rural areas, for the reason that he frames himself as a commoner, for example, that cares about the rural areas, is anti-corruption, for example, and does not rely on elites anymore to the extent he has consolidated his power. That's why he's likely to redistribute educational resources to rural communities at a point at which this disappears. But secondarily, even if this is false, I would argue that there's a significant spillover effect to the extent there is still middle class and poor people living in Shanghai as well. There are a lot of rural dynasties, for example, that live in areas that are not necessarily elite and rich. That's why comprehensively we win this debate on the metric of vulnerability, and we destroy their case as well. Oppose.
Great, I thank Mim for their speech. I now welcome the 3rd speaker of the affirming team. Here. Third F when you're ready.
Sorry, can I just confirm that I'm audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Yep. Cool. Side negative relies really heavily on proving in this debate that they fix an issue of inequality. We were more than happy to agree that that issue existed, but notably, we pointed out firstly, that they did not address it, and secondly, that we did so far more effectively. So let's start by pointing out that they failed to actually address the problem of inequality. We provide you at first negative and second negative with 6 reasons why inequality will still exist, why the rich will still get ahead and why the poor will still get screwed on their side in the absence of coaching colleges. Firstly, we explained to you that geographic distribution at schools means that people who live in big cities like Shanghai have access to far better high schools, far better primary schools than people who live in rural areas that are significantly undeveloped, they're incredibly poor, where no good teachers live, and where they're significantly under-resourced. Secondly, we say that if you have better educated parents, then that inherently gives you an advantage on doing things like completing homework or learning tasks. Tota's response is, well, your parents probably forgot a lot of stuff that they learned in school, but I know, for example, that my dad tutored me a lot in calculus and so on in the lead up to university. I'm sure most parents would have some level of skill in those kinds of things. But thirdly, that was only one of the mechanisms we provided. Thirdly, we say that if you're rich, you can access things like foreign tutoring from countries that aren't China. You could pay for the very expensive American tutoring or UK tutoring for your child in order to get ahead. Fourthly, we said that you could get tutoring that was not from a company, you could get it from an individual private tutor who could still charge for their services because the crackdown was on companies in particular. They said that these individuals wouldn't be willing to risk jail. We suggest that one, it's unclear that they would be because it is not necessarily the thing the crackdown is over. But two, we would suggest that the profit incentive is probably sufficiently high to motivate individuals to do so anyway. Fifthly, we suggest that these individuals probably have political connections that mean they can just pull strings or get leaks or get favors that get them into university regardless of their academic performance. Sixthly, we suggest that they probably could just have, like, if you're very rich and well connected, you probably just have relatives or friends who are teachers or tutors or university professors who you could just ask to tutor your son for no money at all as a favor or in return for some other service to not fall afoul of these laws. All of which mean that the rich still get advantaged. They try some sort of desperate responses to this, like the Gaokao would be made easier and so on, but their own logic comes back to bite them. Because the test is still zero sum, whether it's easier or whether it's harder, some kids will still do relatively better than other kids, and those kids will still be the rich kids. So they don't get ahead on the only metric that they actually wanted to defend in this debate, which is why they must lose. What do we then say on the issue of education? We explain to you, firstly, that why it's likely to get better. Their claim here is that you have an incentive to restrict access to tutoring as a tutor, so that therefore there will be very limited access. We point out that one, it's unclear that's true. You probably want lots of students that you can get lots of money. But even if it was true that you as an individual tutor wanted to minimize the number of students you could charge more, you weren't the only tutor in the market. There were thousands of them. It was a very profitable industry in the absence of this policy, which meant that those individuals would have desire to compete with you, to go for students you weren't going for, to open and tap into new markets. And importantly, we said that there were very low marginal costs, right? You develop a resource and then it doesn't cost you anything additional to share it with more people. So it was free profit. So there would at least be some companies that would target all the very poor people who seem like, even if they individually don't have much money, collectively would have far more money than like the one or two elites, that one tutor would target in order to maximize their profit. But notably, their last claim here is just that, well, in the absence of this, Xi Jinping would expand schools massively and fix all of the educational inequality problems. One, this is obviously well beyond the political capital that this team has to expend. We explained to you all the way at first negative why this policy would take extremely little political capital, and therefore they don't really have the capacity to counterprop anything. We also explained structurally why school reform is likely to be very difficult and unlikely in China. We explained that services are provided by the local government, not the federal government. We explained that the Haokao system ties people geographically to only receive services in their local area, so they can't move to areas where services are better, like in cities. We explained that Haokao, like local governments, have very little means to generate money. They often do so by selling things like land, but that precipitated things like the Evergrande crisis, so their capacity to do so is now limited. But secondly, that is a mechanism of generating money that only works if you're a local government in the cities where land is valuable, not in countries where the land is not valuable. All of which explains why the places that most need better services won't get it. If their claim was that the federal government would suddenly pump cash in or reform all of these systems, note this is well beyond the political capital they have to operate with in this debate. They do not nearly enough analysis to explain why any of this is likely. Their last harm here is just to say that it's very unfortunate that a large number of people overstudy because of the competitiveness of the schooling system that results in mental health issues and stress and lots of stress, etc. Firstly, there are obviously a range of ways we can tackle this without doing in addition to our policy, we could regulate against overstudy studying in the same way China regulates against more than like 3 hours of gaming a week. Secondly, we could obviously provide information as to why those things are undesirable and you should not do it to your kids. But more importantly, those are harms that occur on their side as well, right? Because the Gaokao still exists. It's still extremely competitive. Parents still put pressure on their kids to do better because they believe it's the key to success, which means that they would still force their kids to study. They just wouldn't do it with a tutor. They do it on their own without help and less productively, which is not a benefit for them. It makes things far more stressful. They claim then that like parents would now, realizing they can't buy their way into their kids' way into college, instead teach them to learn a trade or something. One, unclear where they're learning the trade from. There's a deficit of technical schools, which is part of the problem. Two, don't explain why their parents wouldn't still view university as so much more desirable than trades that this would never occur to them. But three, also fail to explain why it was that this was the likely alternative. But lastly, we explain that even if all of this is untrue, that education is not zero sum, right? Like you learn more things when you get more tutoring, and that is a benefit even if rich kids learn more than you. Like you being able to have literacy and numeracy skills, which Brendan explains to your first negative, 30% of kids in rural China do not, means that your life is infinitely better. You learning advanced physics when you otherwise would not makes your life better. You learning maths, English, literature, arts, history, all makes your life better. It helps you make better decisions because you're better educated. It helps you make better political decisions and be more politically informed and politically engaged. It gives you meaning and fulfillment in your life, and it gives you options for your career you would not otherwise have. This was such a devastatingly large benefit because it meant things like children who were extremely underprivileged and poor got access to the basic education that made their life infinitely better, and they had no response to it. That is the first way we win the debate, by a huge margin right there, because they failed to ever engage with any of our content on education beyond the inequality stuff, and which they did incredibly poorly. Secondly, though, we win the debate on economics. Incredibly poor engagement here. We explain a series of ways as to why this is a very useful and necessary form of economic growth for China. The fact that they've saturated existing forms of capital investment in things like infrastructure and factories, that they're less competitive now as wages go up, that they need to get into things like technology and service economy, and that this is where they have a first mover advantage, high domestic demand, and are very good at innovating, which is why they should drive growth through this, why they should set up national champions through this, and that it could only occur when you had profit incentives, CCP approval, and cheap foreign capital that could do things like loss lead. They had no responses except to say that this would actually scare away foreign capital because you're changing the rules. One, that harm's maximized. We're talking about China, right? Like there's already lots of barriers to foreign capital. They're going there anyway. Secondly, we point out empirically it's untrue. Lots of foreign capital invests here. But three, the reason they do so is because they need high growth projects, and there's a lot of growth to be made by investing in China. Their last dying claim is to say that trickle-down economics doesn't work. Who cares about economic growth? Well, everyone should, because it means more taxes paid, which means better services. It means the development of better industries, which means people have better jobs that pay better wages. It means the infrastructure was better, which means that you had better hospitals, and we got you better schools through that mechanism, which is why you should care about all the things we tell you, which is why we win this debate incredibly clearly, and which is why we are so proud to affirm.
Great. I thank them for their speech. I now welcome the third speaker of the negative team. Here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to engage with Udai's 6 reasons as to why we did improve our counterfactual and actually point out why we responded to every single one of them and they failed to respond to our responses. Secondly, I'm going to talk about accessibility for rural schools and why they don't particularly solve that problem. And in fact, why we help these people better on our side of the house. And lastly, if I have time, I'll talk about economic growth, which I don't think we really need to elaborate on because they seem to have given it up in their side. And I don't think they sufficiently respond to Tota. So firstly, I want to engage with Udai's so-called 6 reasons why inequality is not solved on our side of the house. house, right? Firstly, before everything, I just want to point out it's a question of comparative, right? In our side of the house, in our worst case scenario, right, rich people still have some level of comparative advantage over the poor, but to the degree that there's less competitive advantage, right? Obviously, we are giving poor people, obviously, we are giving middle class people a comparatively better chance to enter things like universities. So that's still on a comparative better than what they provide. And I don't think they failed to engage with that nuance, right? But let's look in detail. Firstly, they say, there's geographic distributions. There are better schools in cities, right? And the better schools within cities, right? I think we already gave mechanisms as to why this was something that was likely to be solved within the long run, right? We told you that China already had an incentive to invest within rural education for the reason of its Common Prosperity Program, which is currently doing things like, for example, pressuring corporations to donate to rural areas. It's already doing things like, for example, investing more in rural education, right? Udai says we have no fiat. Yes, we agree. We don't have any fiat. That's why we proved likelihood analysis, the fact that China is doing this as a main policy initiative right now, the fact that China has incentive to do it for the reason that it wants to reduce things like education and inequality gap, for the reason that that increases its legitimacy, it improves its standing and social support. That's why it is doing it. All of these reasons were provided, right? What this means is that the central government does and will continue to increase support for things like rural governments and public schools in the future, which means the debate is not about literacy or calculation. That is symmetric on both sides of the house. It's the question of like ancient Chinese poetry and English grammar that is going to be taught on their side of the house, which doesn't provide any sort of economic growth benefits, as we've already established, right? The second thing they say is, you have better educated parents, right? And we told you that parents are unlikely to be able to teach things like ancient Chinese poetry or the like technical, difficult things that come out in the Gaokao for the reason that it was like 30 years ago since they did it, right? The only response they had to this was, but my dad, which is not really a response compared to the mechanism that we provide, that parents are likely to have forgotten about how to teach and do the Gaokao, right? We have mechanism, they have an example. Obviously, we are winning this one. Thirdly, they say that, you can get tutoring for places like the UK or Australia, right? Like, firstly, obviously, like these are not exam preps for the Gaokao, they're exam preps for studying in the UK. So still we're able to not decrease competition for like schools in China, right? But secondly, I'm not sure why these aren't targets of the crackdown as well. Like obviously China would also monitor if you were getting Gaokao tutor prepping from the UK or Australia. We don't have Zoom here, we have VU, which is monitored by the Chinese state. So I don't know why they can access these things. Fourthly, they say you can get individual tutors, right? Again, I'm pretty sure the TCP will monitor this to the degree that they're passing this policy in the first place, and to the degree that people in the upper echelons of society don't want to risk being put in jail, they don't have an incentive to actually do this. Again, we already said it, zero response. Thirdly, they say that, you have things like political connections. This may be true, but I would argue that this is very limited, right? For the reason that there are only a few hundred people in places like the CCP. So at best, it's like the 3% of the richest people in the society who will like actually be able to gain this information. The overwhelming majority of the upper and upper middle classes will not, which means that still on a comparative, we gave comparative advantage to the lower middle classes. Lastly, they say that relative and friends can teach you, right? And like, sure, they can, but they don't prove why this is likely, why these people have the skills to get you through the Gaokao, and why specifically friends and relatives of the rich have the ability to like uplift you and make sure you get into like the top 3% of Gaokao scores and into PK University. They try to make these sound like they were mechanisms. They were not. They were already responded to, and they were just examples and assertions, which is why we comprehensively already proved why the comparative advantage for rich people is likely to decrease and why we offer better accessibility on our side of the house, right? Note that this also tackles their point about rural education and economic growth, because it's us that proved that this economic growth actually trickles down to people on the ground to the degree that like the lower echelons of society are now able to access things like university jobs. But moreover, we also provide increased accessibility for rural people, because to the degree that they don't have to compete with hyper educated and super privileged like urban people anymore, right? That's why we give them an advantage to actually enter things like universities. So that's enough to defeat all of their points, right? Secondly, I'm going to talk about accessibility, and this was the main and the most reasonable push coming from them. They say that, now rural people can access things like online education, right? Firstly, I'm not sure why they can access this in the first place, because if their case is that people in rural China are illiterate and they can't do calculation, I'm not sure why they can afford these sort of things in the first place. They're probably desperate just to keep food on the table. They don't have money to spare on things like online education. We don't even know if they have fucking internet, right? When I think also Ryosuke and Tota already gave you a lot of analysis about why this is likely to be expensive and therefore inaccessible. They fail to respond again. Secondly, right, but looking more on, then they try to say that, but this, what is the mechanism they have about why this is cheap, right? Firstly, they say that, there's a fixed cost, so it's really cheap to distribute. Tota already extensively responded to this. He talked about how you need to do things like advertise these videos, so there's an additional cost. You have to spend a lot of money for each video you distribute. We talked about how this, if you distribute these videos very cheaply, you'll piss rich people off, right? Because they want to access the same goods at the same prices. Or you do things like, if it's just videos about online tutoring, right? Like China has its own version of YouTube, so I'm not even sure why that's something that's asymmetric in the first place, right? Then they say that, there's an incentive to do things like competition, right? But this is true, but I would argue that it's likely to be competition that gears towards creating better services for the rich as opposed to lowering its prices for the poor, for the reason that even if you lower your prices for the poor, it's likely that the amount of return you get is very small, but the fixed costs, i.e. people like educated tutors, i.e. people like university students, are likely to demand a certain amount of wage because they don't have to be tutors. They can be interns at good companies. They can have other alternative jobs that pay them well. So if the price and the paying that they get is so low, they're unlikely to be tutors in the first place, right? Which is why they do need people who are willing to pay a heavy or a substantial price for these services in the first place. So they're more likely to focus on, for example, providing better classes for the rich as opposed to lowering their prices for the poor. They never proved that competition was likely to move in the way of pushing prices down, right? Then they say that, rich people can still push their child into getting into a good university, right? Again, firstly, like they might want to do it, but they can't to the degree that we take away their methods for doing it because they don't have private tutors anymore. Secondly, again, they're not able to do that, right? China monitors WeChat, it monitors Google, it monitors everything. They can't just like go on Zoom and access a tutor. That makes no sense, right? But even their best case scenario, right? Where I assume that rural people in rural China are able to access education now, that still doesn't make them better, right? Because the things that they, even if they can't get education, still the richer people can afford things like more premium classes with better teachers. They can still access the best tutors and the better curriculum, right? And those get already told you that university is a zero-sum game. So if everybody becomes smarter, it's not like the university allows everybody to enter. It still only takes the like top 1,000 people, like the people with the 1,000 highest grades, and those people are still going to be the rich. So in their side of the house, I'm not sure why increasing accessibility for rural people was actually a benefit in the first place, considering the fact that they were still going to lose out to the rich. They weren't going to be able to get into university. Lastly, about economic growth, right? Like firstly, I just want to point out they have zero mechanization of why education leads to growth. They say education, human capital, infrastructure. There's a huge logical gap there. I don't know why increased human capital leads to more industries or leads to more jobs. Like it's just an utter assertion that is never ever mechanized even one line from their side of the house, right? But secondly, again, we say the type of education that's likely to be provided in their world is things like remembering ancient Chinese poems or things like the name of proteins. It's not literacy, so it doesn't contribute to economic growth in any sort of way. If it's things like university education where you actually learn the skills, that's symmetric on both sides of the house. So I'm not sure what kind of substantial benefit in terms of human growth even happens on their side of the house. And for those reasons, we have comprehensively taken this debate.
Great, I think moving for their speech, I now welcome back the leader of the negative team, here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first and the least important question in this debate is, will the economy become more prosperous under the world of the affirmative? There are two problems with the affirmative's case. Number one, they do not show why the problem exists with regards to manufacturing sector in the first instance, nor do they explain why the service sector will revive the economy in the first place. Second of all, they do nothing to show why private education provided all of the things that were necessary for the service industry to grow in the first instance. In fact, we denied all of these things coming from all of the three speakers in our bench. In addition to this, we flipped all of their claims on 3 grounds. Number one, we said the incentives changed under our world that directed parents to more useful and practical skills, for example, that directly lead to employment. Number two, we said we reduced the problem of burnout that is very pervasive in China and in many Asian societies. Number three, we said they create additional uncertainty that works as a reason as to why the Western investors particularly do not want to invest in China, and they would redirect their money to elsewhere. And that is why they lose this debate on the basis of economy. But even if you think they win on this basis, this is significantly less important because they do nothing to show why economic prosperity prosperity was a benefit in the first instance, apart from saying infrastructure, which is obviously not mechanized at all. We prefer a world, obviously, that this was more accessible, which is our paradigm. The second and the more important question in this debate is which form of education is more accessible? Is it the one where we only have public education, or is it one where a combination of private and public exists? There are two reasons that we provided as to why competition and the problems regarding the educational industry is unique to private education and the existence of it. Number one, we said that the industry and education is inherently competitive for the economic incentives that these industries provide in the first instance. So these are the cause of competition and the fear amongst parents to begin with. Secondarily, we said it is the reason why the test is highly inaccessible in the status quo, because these private organizations have an incentive to increase the bar to make them look more, precious and useful to students to begin with. This means a couple of things. Number one, it means we get less competition under our world, and their response to this was that, well, we can regulate this. Political capital though, where does it come from? Number two, even if competition does not disappear under our world, we prove that this will be significantly more accessible. Yes, competition remains, but the question changes under our world. Is it the money under their world? Under our world, it's going to be effort, right? Because the amount of knowledge that is required for you to pass Gaokao in the first instance is going to be massively reduced. At the point at which that is true, you're likely to be able to understand them by yourself by reading textbook, for example, as opposed to having to go to private tutors, for example, that is massively exclusive under their world. So even if you buy this to be true, I would suggest that we are significantly better on the our side of us. But lastly, we said this is the moment at which the redistribution that is taking place within public education is likely to come into effect, because we told you the reasons as to why this exists in the first instance, why Xi Jinping had an incentive to do this. The response was obviously insufficient because they don't give any reason as to why this is unlikely to happen. What were the more substantial reasons or responses that we hear from the affirmative? Number one, they said the rich would still get ahead, but the reasons that they provide, although many, weren't really sophisticated in the first instance. They said good schools in Shanghai, but those are probably private. They said access to relatives and foreign education. They said, but you don't really know whether these relatives exist. You don't really know whether foreign tutors are useful in the context of China, nor did they prove why these people are willing to teach them, especially when it was dangerous for them to do so in the first instance. But at the very least, even if you believe into everything that they say, at the very least, the scale is super, super small, and it doesn't amount to changing the Gaokao and raising the standard as much as it is in the status quo. So this was just rubbish. Secondly, they said this is more accessible. Online education is more accessible. Number one, they didn't really show why there was an interest or incentive to do this in the first instance. In fact, we flipped all of that when we said it was an economic suicide to do this, because you're more likely to lose the more important sort of customers under their world. Secondly, they did nothing to show why this was not symmetric under our world, because we told you that if it is just about fixed cost, obviously that is not going to be business in the first place. So that would presumably exist under our world as well. So, at the end of all of that, I think the affirmative fails to prove why the additional margin of knowledge that they uniquely get was something meaningful in the first instance. We told you that the access to education, even if the level is decreased, is something that is massively more important, because it does not mean anything in terms of your employability nor the prosperity of the economy at the end of the day. We clearly win.
Great. I think we moved their speech. I now welcome back the leader of the affirming team to close the debate. Here.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
All right. One moment. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. 3 questions in this reply. The first question I'll ask is, which side better educates China's children? And the reason I start here is because it's the simplest way for side affirmative to win the debate. That was because we were talking about tens of millions of children, and these children were particularly vulnerable. They were desperately poor, living in China's rural communities. They attended very impoverished schools, and they were often developmentally delayed, or they suffered from malnutrition. And this harm was so large in the debate that it really became larger than the harm of maybe some richer students learning more or learning faster than poorer students, or even outweighed the harm of some students feeling incredibly stressed and miserable about exams. What do we explain here? We told you that there were really large marginal gains to be made, right? Because these kids often struggle with basic literacy and are so behind, any little bit will help them a fair bit. The second thing we explain is there's very low marginal cost in distribution at the point that you're running a large edutech operation. and that will enable people to gain access in rural areas to gain access to that stuff. We think as internet access increases, means that people will be able to gain access to private tutoring services. And thirdly, we explained the reason private tutoring services were willing to do this was because they have a profit motive, which makes them willing to make the upfront investment in kind of hiring tutors, hiring equipment, and building a curriculum. Here's what we hear from side negative. We hear two things. We hear firstly, well, NGOs could also benefit from low marginal cost. That doesn't explain why they have an incentive to aggressively expand in the first place. And secondly, they explain that the central government is likely to step in. We would point out that amusingly, they kind of just repeat kind of like, I don't know, like Xi Jinping thought a fair bit where they just say, well, Xi really cares about rural people, so he's likely to do things about it. And they sort of say that uncritically. But the second thing we point out is they sort of just, the second thing we point out is that also misses the explanation we give. We point out that the hukou system exists and it limits the way in which the local governments can get funding. We provide you all of that funding analysis as to why local governments tend to be very, very poor because they can't sell property in the way that city governments can to keep their revenue streams positive. And compare that to the claim we hear kind of at the start of third negative, which was them name checking one government program to improve access to rural schools. I think it's pretty clear that children in rural China, of which there are millions, are really behind and would benefit from just like more people in general trying to educate them, especially if those people, and we know that the private sector and private actors, because they have a profit motive, are going to be the set of people who are really going to want to do that because they have an interest in doing that. And because they think and they hope that, you know, those rural communities might pool their savings in order to afford those services, all of which meant that those kids got a far better education outside the nets. So we've already won. Second question, which side better deals with educational inequality? We point out through a variety of different mechanisms, the powerful and wealthy almost always find ways to avoid the rules. And that means that like the high levels of the CCP are likely to escape this. We also just point out that just having educated family in general means that kids who are just middle class but have an educated parent are likely to get ahead. They deny this, and by the time we get to third negative, they're trying to explain why your family members don't have a very strong incentive to help you get through school, which seems incredibly counterintuitive. Our claim there is quite simple. If you're educated, if you're rich, you're highly likely to want you're highly likely to be better able to help your kid get through school, which means a lot of the inequitable issues are likely to reproduce. CF, all of the explanation we give as to why the school system is really bad in the status quo, you don't solve any of those issues by banning the private tutoring sector. That would not be the way to solve that problem. Finally, on which side is better for the economy? We explain that growth comes in stages. You often start off with a really high capital phase, which China has done. That capital depreciates with time and obviously becomes oversaturated. You can't continue these build new roads everywhere. You need to start to slowly transition to a consumer economy where people consume a lot of services and you perform more high value manufacturing and things like tech, which of course educational technology is a key example of that. And their chain of responses here is really funny because at second negative we're told that, oh, like why does economic growth even matter? Udai then, because they didn't respond to it, doesn't say very much beyond whipping how important growth is. And then third neg says, oh, well, because Udai didn't talk very much about it, clearly they've abandoned the point. No, guys, you just didn't really respond to the point, which is why we knew it was a runaway victory. We explained that when you educate people more, that education has a higher level of human capital. They are more productive. They're able to do more complex tasks. They're able to do more complex things. That's why teaching them about proteins, as third negative tried to push, was unambiguously a good thing. It was also why it was incredibly important for the economy to grow, because when that economy grows, that people become wealthier. People
Brendan, it's 4:30.
Have more things. Oh, sorry, my timer broke. Incredibly proud to propose.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both teams. Please leave the room and best of luck for the break and also the rest of your tournament.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for